Right, thank you. So let me start where at WWF's point of departure here. This is our latest Living Planet report, 2012, just launched last week from the International Space Station. We do this every 2 years. It's a State of the World report. And it gets into some of the details that Tim has touched on here, but just to give you very briefly 2 headlines only. We've tracked since 1970 a species index of thousands of different populations of different species. It's a kind of health of biodiversity on the planet, a quick check on that. That's suffered about a 28% decline since 1970. So that sounds already quite a concerning headline figure. Now, it's at least double that in many tropical ecosystems. So those ecosystems that are richest, that supply many of those services that Tim was talking about, are falling even more rapidly than the headline figure there. The ecological footprint headline, the alarming 50% overshoot. In other words, it takes the planet a year and a half to restore, to recreate the goods and services and to replenish from the pollution that we put in the atmosphere each year. So that's clearly a form of ecological overshoot. That's a measure of the demand we're putting on the planet. And it's that demand, in particular habitat loss, that is leading to the natural systems upon which all of our food, water, and energy depend, coming under very, very stark pressure. Nature. This is Borneo for you. I think Tim's covered this section admirably, just to pick up 1 or 2 points of why nature is so important to us and to our food system. It's not just those direct goods and services that we need from nature that are so important. It's things such as climate regulation, on which absolutely everything depends. The forests, the lungs of the planet do that for us. And it's not just the direct provision of food, for example. It's things such as pollination of our crops that would be virtually impossible, incalculably expensive to do by artificial means, is done for us by the natural systems on which we depend. About half of all synthetic drugs come from natural sources. So again, if we're thinking about the rapid development of technologies that are tremendously important for people, most of those are still rooted very directly in these natural systems. But I want just to take us beyond those immediate concerns and just think a little bit about the future. Because the point about this, I think, is the irreplaceability of much of it. The planet is extremely good at cycling and recycling and restoring things that we've lost. But the question I wanted to ask is, how long do you anticipate human beings will be on this planet? Do you give us 100 years, some centuries, some thousands of years? Let's hope hundreds of thousands of years, like our hominid ancestors, at least. And the question is, sometimes we frame this as looking after the next generation, looking after our children, because that's very motivating. But when you're looking at the irreplaceable nature of species lost and the needs that generations, perhaps thousands of generations ahead of us will need, it's quite important to think in quite different terms about the biodiversity and the rates of biodiversity lost. This is not just for people that are naturalists that like furry species like the one you see on WWF adverts. This is about epidemics, for example. The genetic resources that we will need to draw on to deal with future mass epidemics that we can't even imagine yet. Not only human epidemics, but also crop diseases. We're already in an arms race in relation to the production of food, in an arms race with microbes, and they tend to evolve very much faster than we can keep up. Again, all those genetic resources from the thousands of species that we are losing each year could potentially be absolutely vital for human survival under a planet with a population of 9 or 10 billion people. So that's why it's important. Just to touch on then, very briefly, 3 examples from agriculture. You'll be familiar with the headline example. I just wanted to touch on perhaps one different kind of point from each. So this is a different view of Borneo. You saw the rainforest view. This is, of course, palm oil plantations. You'll be familiar with that. The key question here is, palm oil looks like a very efficient way of growing calories. There's a reason why it's in half of all prepackaged foods that you will buy on the supermarket shelves in the UK. It's an extremely efficient way of growing what is just called on the label vegetable oil. So if we're thinking about sustainable intensification, we need to be really clear what that means by that. It's not clearly just about efficiency, improving efficiencies, because this is highly efficient in one sense. The other point is, this is not going to be solved by consumers alone. So if you've got a product that is virtually invisible, an ingredient in half of all prepackaged foods, that is extremely difficult to solve that problem through consumer pressure. I'm a director of campaigns. I'm interested in consumer leverage. But it's exceptionally difficult to develop standards in a way that is motivating, that you will have people choosing differently from the enormous different number of products that have palm oil in them. So we make the link with orangutans, and that's, again, highly motivating. But ultimately, this is going to have to be standards that are developed by companies, by the private sector, and enforced, entrenched, leveled up in terms of those standards, in terms of regulation. We're not going to do this through consumer power alone. Those are the impacts if we don't meet that challenge. You've seen the almost entirely covered with forests in 1900, and much less than half left at this stage. But there's still an enormous amount well worth protecting in the heart of Borneo there. Asparagus. So if you're enjoying asparagus this week, I hope and expect you are enjoying the best of Britain has to offer. It's local, it's tasty, and it is fresh, and above all, it's produced using rainwater. As Caroline said, about 70% of available water resources on the planet are used to irrigate agriculture. But of course, the season here is quite short. So the demand for asparagus is skyrocketing in both North America and the EU. Where does that come from? The lead country you might not know is Peru. So Peru is absolutely dominant in global asparagus exports now. And there are aspects of that that are an extremely good thing. You know, these are jobs. These are not the very best jobs by ILO standards, but they are a long way from the worst jobs. There are many families, poor families, that are now having a vastly better standard of life through that explosion in asparagus production in Peru. There are children that are able to stay at school longer. So no one is denying the vital importance of these jobs. And those are new through that export industry. I think a lot of people in the UK think instinctively, what's the problem here? It's the air miles. And you'll see a lot of retailers are helpfully labelling air miles on exported goods. Actually, with asparagus, that pales in significance in comparison with the freshwater impacts. This is an astonishing picture. These are asparagus fields, irrigated, basically in a desert. Those are sand dunes on the hills in the background. This area of Peru that produces this asparagus has less than a millimetre of rainwater per year. And the point here is not to say this is undoable, but at the moment, over the last 8 years since this started lifting off, the water table has just collapsed in this area. So that my point is fundamentally those jobs are tremendously important, but let's get away from this sense in which there's a fundamental tension between jobs and the environment, because all of those jobs that we saw in the slide before depend absolutely on our ability to replenish the water table on which those jobs depend. It's not that there's some luxurious environment out there that we environmentalists want to protect, and somehow that's in tension with jobs. All of those jobs are fake jobs. They're short-term jobs unless we can solve this problem, because those people will be out of work in 5 or 10 years, and the companies will move on to the next place unless we solve the water table problem that underpins that. Last example, the miracle of the Sahara. The Sahara is the area of savanna in Brazil. People are very familiar with the problems of chopping down the rainforest for soya production. This picture was the one The Economist used actually under that headline about 2 years ago, talking about the miracle of the industrialization of the Sahara. And the point is that savanna has had terribly poor soils, and modern technology has enabled us to grow soya production, to feed the rapid demand for grain for rapid expansion in meat-eating diets around the planet, both in the global north but also in China. The question is that a miracle? So in a sense, again, technology is solving part of our intensification problem. These were lands that were unusable for agriculture in the past. But again, what about the communities that depended on those natural resources on those lands beforehand? What about the extremely rich biodiversity, the number of different endemic species from the Sahara that have now been lost because of that? We might reach the conclusion that that was a price worth paying. The point was no one had that debate. This just plows on ahead. Those resources are irreplaceably lost now. Those species are lost. And we have now a monoculture here to feed rapidly expanding meat-eating diets. So again, the point is we need a democratic debate about which of those resources are we going to conserve, which might we need to sacrifice in order to feed 9 billion people. But let's make sure we have that very consciously, because what has been thrown away in this environment, in this landscape, is an irreplaceable loss. So moving on to Rio, I think 4 key challenges here that come out of those. One of the major points, I think, is the standards. So we've looked at both soya and palm oil in terms of the Sahara and Borneo there. The standards, the round tables on both of those products are sets of industry-developed standards that are pushing the limits in terms of trying to develop a common platform for sustainability and for social sustainability within the areas producing those products. The key question is, how can we go beyond the limits that Tim pointed to there? Those round tables have already stretched the mass market in those areas beyond where that would have been in the past. That's tremendously important. But the key thing is, how can we make sure that those standards are not just a set of voluntary standards through those companies that choose to work together and to sign up to those? How do we ensure through Rio that those standards, including through lobbying by companies such as yourselves, level up through the regulatory system those standards so that you are not undercut by those companies that are not meeting those standards? So I think that transition from standards and certification through to a sense in which, in order to meet the huge sustainability challenges in the food system, we need those standards to be entrenched, to be adopted far more widely globally, is something that Rio is ideally placed to consider and to work on. It's not going to appear in the outcome document text, but in a sense the point of this is the opportunity for private sector and governments to come together to work through how to do this. I think that the second key area is just to think again about production subsidies. It is extraordinary in a global financial and economic crisis that we're still spending taxpayers' money subsidizing forms of production that are clearly utterly unsustainable. So again, we thought we might have plucked all of the low-hanging fruits under that agenda by now. Sadly, we haven't. Again, those are absolute win-wins. Surely if there are a need to direct subsidies anywhere, they'd better be to be tackling the knotty sustainability challenges that are there. The third difficult area is that of consumption. And I think the point here is it's not sufficient if you look at those examples of intensification that were not sustainable intensification. It's not sufficient just to do this through technology alone. It's those rapid demanding, for example, for meatful diets, that if you do the numbers, it looks almost impossible to grow enough grain to feed the meat-producing animals for everyone to have the kind of diets that we take for granted in this country. That's a very difficult area. No policymaker wants to be telling people what to do. But I think the key thing is to get away from the sense in which this is about voluntary behaviour. This is to recognise that actually it's about getting the true costs of food into food. It's about trade, it's about wider policy mechanisms for ensuring that the real costs of food are in the long term incorporated into food itself. And my final point is, again, coming back to the Secretary of State's point about the overall Sustainable Development Goals and the framing of those. Yes, it's absolutely about food, water, and energy for all. But that's only going to be possible into the future if we have a resilient natural system that underpins food, water, and energy for all. And that resilience of those natural systems needs to be put at the heart of those new development goals. Thank you.